I rewatched Life of Pi recently, the one with the boy and the tiger stranded on the lifeboat, and there is this moment, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Earlier in the film, before any of that happens, Pi is going through this phase where he is exploring every religion he can find. And in one quick shot, you see what he's reading is not a religious text, it's a French novel, a pretty dark one actually. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop thinking about it because here's the thing, I just finished reading the exact book a few weeks earlier. I've made a whole video and a podcast episode connecting it to, of all people, the footballer Mbappé, and then, completely by accident, I sit down to rewatch a film I've seen before, and there it is again, sitting in someone's hands on screen. Why that book? Why him? Why now? It felt like one of those little synchronicities, the kind of thing that's probably been there for long. You just don't notice it until you're already paying attention. So I went looking for the actual answer, and it turns out there's a real history behind it and a much stranger connection than I expected. Bonjour tout le monde! Welcome to Rachelle mais français. I'm Rachelle. This is where I talk about French culture, language, literature, and whatever rabbit hole I've fallen into that week. If you're new here, and especially if you're someone who loves the French language and the French culture too, this is a pretty good one to start with. So quick reassurance before we start, you don't need to have read the book or seen the movie to follow this. I'm going to walk you through both. What you need to know, nothing more, because the real story here isn't really about either of them individually. It's about why they quietly point at each other and what they says about two completely different ways of surviving something unbearable. So, quick setup for anyone who hasn't seen Life of Pi. It's about a boy from India, Pi Patel, who survives a shipwreck and ends up on a lifeboat with a Bengal tiger for company for months. That's the headline version everyone knows. But before any of that happens, there's a whole earlier section of the story where young Pi is figuring out what he believes. He ends up practicing Hinduism, Christianity and Islam all at once, much to his parents' confusion, just trying on every framework he can find for making sense of the world. And it's during that session that the camera lingers, just for a second, on what he's reading is Albert Camus' L'étranger, The Strangers, or sometimes translated to The Outsider, which is a strange thing for a researching, deeply religious Indian teenager to be reading, if you think about it, because L'étranger is about as far from religious comfort as a novel gets. So here's the question I actually sat with. Why would this character be reading French literature at all? And the answer isn't just the filmmaker picked a cool book. There's a real history behind it. Pi's hometown, Pondicherry, wasn't just an Indian town. It was the capital of French India. Most people only ever learned about British colonization of India. I certainly did. But the French had their own colonial foothold there too, starting all the way back in 1674, and here's the wild part. They held onto it until 1954, a full 7 years after India got its independence from Britain. Even for now, Pondicherry still has French colonial architecture, French street names, and, this is the key detail, French is still taught in schools there today. So a boy growing up in Pondicherry reading Camus in the original French isn't some random detail the author threw in. It's exactly the kind of thing that would actually happen to a real kid from that specific town. Which means, before we even get to what the book means, there is this whole hidden layer of French colonial history sitting quietly underneath the story everyone assumes is purely Indian. So let's actually talk about L'étranger because it's worth understanding on its own, not just a prop in someone else's story. So it's a quick spoiler-light version. It follows a man named Murso living in French Algeria. His mother dies and he doesn't grieve the way people expect him to, so no tears, no big display. Later, in a moment of heat and confusion on a beach, he kills a man. He puts on trial. And the trial ends up focusing less on the killing itself and more on the fact that he didn't cry at his mother's funeral. Society essentially punishes him for refusing to perform emotions he didn't feel, for telling the truth about his indifference instead of faking the expected grief. You know, this book is genuinely a big deal in France, not just a famous novel, but something closer to foundational. It's a staple of the French baccalaureate, the standard high school curriculum. Nearly every French teenager reads it in school. Some critics consider it the most widely read French novel of the entire 20th century. And it's actually the single most mentioned French text on UK university applications from students who want to study French, probably partly because it's short and partly because Camus wrote it in unusually simple French, almost stripped of complex verb tenses, which makes it one of the first real, unsimplified novels a language learner can actually get through. If you're learning French and looking for your first real novel, this is usually the one people recommend. By the way, I've linked a few ways to grab this in the description box below. No matter physical copy, Kindle, or the audiobook, whatever suits you. Quick heads up, for Kindle and Audible, if you've never tried it before, there's always a free trial, so it's a low commitment way to see if it fits how you actually like to read or listen. Speaking of which, if you're learning French, generally consider the audiobook version in French. It's written in such simple, plain French that it doubles as great listening practice. Those are all affiliate links, by the way. Small percentage supports my channel, no extra cost to you. So let's come back to the book. The author, Albert Camus, won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957. He was born and raised in French Algeria himself, which matters because the book has a real controversy sitting inside it. The Arab man who Meursault kills is never given a name in the entire novel. That silence has been debated by scholars and writers for decades, and in 2013, it actually got a direct literary response, a novel called The Meursault Investigation, which retells the same story from the perspective of the victim's own brother, giving him back the name and the humanity the original book withheld. Okay, so now we know what the book is, and we know how a boy in Pondicherry could plausibly be reading it. But here's the question that actually kept me up. Why this book? For this character at this moment in his story? I went looking for what other people had made of this, and the red that stuck with me framed it as less of a similarity and more of a mirror image. What does it mean? Here's what I mean, both stories, if you strip them down, end the exact same way. A person who survived something unbearable, sitting in front of a panel of officials who don't believe their account of what happened. For Meursault, it's a courtroom. For Pi, it's a room with Japanese shipping investigators after he's rescued, who flatly refuse to believe a story involving a tiger. And both stories ask basically the same question: which version do you believe? But here's where they completely diverge. Meursault refuses to give anyone a comforting version. He tells the truth, even though the truth is what destroys him. He won't perform grief he didn't feel, won't perform remorse he doesn't have. Even facing a death sentence, he stays loyal to the raw, uncomfortable truth all the way to the end. While Pi, on the other hand, does the opposite. When the investigators refuse to believe the tiger story, he offers them a second version, which is a much darker, more plausible one without any animals that lines up with what possibly actually happened on that lifeboat. And then he asks them, and really, he's asking the audience, which story do you prefer? And when they choose the version with the tiger, the version that's easier to live with, Pi says something like, and so it goes with God. He's not defending the tiger story as literal truth. He's defending the idea that sometimes the story that lets you survive is worth more than the story that's simply accurate. So here's what I think that quick, easy to miss shot of Camus in Pi's hands is actually doing. It's placing two answers to the exact same question side by side. Without ever saying so out loud, Myoso says, I will not lie to make this easier for anyone, even me, even if it costs me my life. And Pai says, I will choose the version I can live with, even if it isn't strictly true. Same absurd universe, same impossible situation, two completely different people choosing two completely different ways through it. And I don't think the film is telling you which one is right. I think it's just quietly showing you that the question exists and letting you sit with which answer feels more like you. That's the episode. If you've read L'Étranger or watched Life of Pi, or even better, both, I would genuinely love to know which side of that question you land on. Come tell me in the comments. If this sends you down the same rabbit hole it sends me down, the book's linked below if you want to read it for yourself. And if you want more of this kind of things like French culture, language, literature, the odd rabbit hole like this one, that's exactly what my newsletter is for. And the link is below too. Thanks for being here and I'll see you next time.